Gloucester Community Arts Charter School, Tuesday, September 13th. Please note for the record that the time is 4 minutes past 6, and also please note that we are being recorded. We'll quickly review the agenda and then we'll hit the agenda items as they appear. Welcome public comment. We'll review the agenda. Excuse me, I'm out of order. Why don't we start with the welcome and public comment. First of all, welcome everyone. It's a nice turnout. And we have a guest speaker tonight, which is why we're having this meeting tonight. But I just would say this is a time for public comment. If anyone would like to say anything, this would be the time. Okay. Is there any public comment? Okay, please. Okay.
Would you like for me to?
So you can do whatever you said, whatever you said.
Okay.
Come on up. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted you to be aware that there's going to be a piece in the paper tomorrow, whether it's a my view or a letter to the editor, because as chair of the Building and Finance Committee of the school committee, I feel it's important that the community understand charter funding and the issues around it, so that we can hopefully rally around changes in the legislature that will make charter schools in general more accepted, more tolerable, and less detrimental to the districts that they're placed in. So I'll read that to you because I don't want you to be surprised at what's being said, but you do have seen the city resolution, so it can go around that. As the state legislature enters its new session, a bill that would require Commonwealth charter schools to be funded as a line item at the state level warrants our community's collective support and the legislature's approval. The City Council, the school committee, and the mayor's office unanimously passed a resolution in support of this legislation this spring. The resolution garnered collective citywide support because of the benefit it would provide Gloucester and other communities with charter schools. Two statements in the resolution provide the rationale for this change. Whereas the amount of such aid withheld for each student leaving to attend a charter school exceeds by a large factor the amount of per pupil aid that the district receives from the state, and whereas the loss of monies to a district results in either reducing programs in the public schools or raising local taxes, thus shifting additional costs onto taxpayers without their approval, and then goes on to the request. This legislation would require funding at the level of the authorizing body, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or more specifically, the Department or Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Commonwealth charter schools are overseen by the DESE with no local accountability. This change would allocate and more fairly distribute the funding for charter schools across all Massachusetts taxpayers and promote and require more accountability for charter schools and their performance as a whole relative to the cost of operations. In July, our school committee sent a letter to former GCACS board chair Joe Knowles requesting that their board support our city resolution and discuss it in an upcoming meeting. After twice postponing discussion on the matter, it was on the agenda to be discussed at last night's meeting. Charter school funding reform is necessary for communities that have charter schools. It is often said that the money follows the child. While revenues follow the child, costs do not. When 70 students leave the district across 4 grades and 6 schools, few costs can be reduced. The district cannot shut a wing, reduce a teacher, or any of the other minor measures that could possibly happen. Even at higher enrollment, there are only marginal savings, not dollar for dollar, to be gained due to mandated and fixed costs within the district. To provide some comparative information, if GCACS achieves full enrollment, it will have a budget of $2.9 million for 240 students. In contrast, East Gloucester Elementary School, which serves 260 students, with just $1.1 million. At full enrollment, close to 50% of Gloucester's Chapter 78 will be diverted to the charter for the benefit of about 6% of the city's student population. In addition to this proposal, the school committee continues to advocate for changes in charter funding, the charter funding formula itself. Charter schools are funded based on a simple average per pupil that is spent by the home district. This sounds fine on the surface, but in reality, it is a gross oversimplification. There are substantially different costs associated with different student populations. The average amount spent on a kindergartner is different from that spent on a high school senior. The cost of educating students with special needs, some of whom require educational service that can only be provided outside the district, vary widely. Yet the charter per pupil averages the cost of all populations, despite the fact that the charter will never be educating high school students, nor held responsible for expensive out-of-district placements. One can easily see that a simple average cost per student skews charter tuition payments in favor of charter schools that do not serve the same population to the detriment of the district student population. Due to the favorable funding formula, many charter schools have been able to build up surplus balances. Recognizing this as a problem, achievement gap legislation passed in January 2010 now requires charter schools to return a portion of surplus funds. The size of our community is another factor. Larger communities may more easily carry the financial burden of a charter school. With a current population of 28,800 people, Gloucester falls even below the 30,000 population threshold set by the legislature for Commonwealth charter schools. Gloucester's small size makes it even more difficult for us to absorb the diversion of funds to GCACS. For all of these reasons, I urge the board to join city officials in supporting this resolution to change the way Massachusetts funds Commonwealth charter schools. So that'll be in the paper. I also was in contact with Senator Tarr, who had hoped to be here tonight, and I got a call at 5:30. He just got out of session. We had sent this resolution to him. He sent us back a letter supporting this resolution. It's one of the many things that he is going to be pushing for in terms of legislation regarding charter schools, because he knows funding is a very big issue for communities to deal with.
Thank you, Kathy. I'll just add to that I spoke to AJ at Senator Starr's office this morning, and if we can have a board meeting on the 28th, because we have a lot of things to get through this month, Bruce has agreed to show up at 6:30, so we will have him.
Could you tell us your name?
Kathy Clancy.
Kathy Clancy.
I've been on the school committee for
Oh, with a K.
So yeah, we are trying to address this issue. The board has to do its due diligence on it. Since the time when Val sent the letter to Joe, I think there was a long lapse in meetings, and we have tried to get things going. We wanted Mark come here. This was the first meeting he could come to. So we are trying to get a discussion or a review of the issues here, so that the board is actively doing its due diligence on this matter. Thank you.
Jim?
Is there more public comment? Sure, Val, please.
Bill Gilman, Chair of the Boston School Committee, back again. Thank you. I felt very comfortable here last week. I want you to know that. I thought it was very clear to me that you understand that our issue that we bring forward right now is our concern about the funding of charter schools, and I appreciate that. I'm also very appreciative that Mark came here. I understand he lives in Western Mass, so I know that it's a long ride. We met in the parking lot, and I appreciate that. I brought some more copies of the letter to Joe Knowles. I've got this, and I've got the budget again here for anybody to see that. Perhaps you will see this from last week. I'll leave it at the back door. But I have a series of questions that I would really love the board to consider asking Mark as he talks about the funding. And it kind of captures the outline of some of Kathy's points. But some of my issues regarding the funding, and I did read your my view that you sent several weeks ago, possibly about a month ago, so I understand your views. But some of my issues that I was hoping the board would ask are, first of all, are you aware that most states, including neighborhood states, fund charter schools through a state line item, which is advocated in our Gloucester City resolution on charter school funding? I've got a copy of this, Jim, so you don't have to write this down. Number two, the Massachusetts legislature created a 30K population threshold for Commonwealth charter schools, yet Gloucester is below the threshold at 28,800. Don't you agree that this makes funding difficult for small school districts like Gloucester, thus the reason that cities under 30K population are regional charters? Number three, the Gloucester Public School District has an out-of-district special ed budget of $3.7 million for 62 students, which is a fixed cost. Don't you agree that this makes it difficult for our district to adjust to the loss of Chapter 70 funds? Does this board understand that if a child's IEP cannot be accommodated at this school or back at the Gloucester Public School District, that these costs are borne by the Gloucester Public School District? If the current Commonwealth charter school funding formula is fair to districts, why have a large percentage of Commonwealth charter schools been able to build large surplus balances while their home districts are making budget cuts? This fact led to the Mass Legislature passing a state education bill in early 2010 requiring charter schools surplus revenue in excess of 20% to be returned to the state and the sending districts. For example, Mystic Valley Regional Charter School had a $1.3 million surplus in 2010. Number 5, if charter schools are driven to promote collaboration with their school districts in the positive spirit of coexistence, why wouldn't the Mass Charter School Association, particularly in small communities such as Gloucester, encourage our legislators to lobby for equitable charter funding bills for Commonwealth charter schools and or require in-district models like Horace Mann or innovation schools for small districts? As you recall, Dave, Tony, Gordon, you were on the board at the time. You recall our compromise proposal that we made in August, looking for the support of an in-district model, a Horace Mann or an innovation school as an alternative where we wouldn't be strapped with this financial deficit and we could serve in more of a collaborative manner. Number 6, why does the leadership of the Mass Charter School Association promote Commonwealth charter schools over in-district Horace Mann schools? If it's because of the union independence, we understand that there are 2 current Commonwealth charter schools in Massachusetts that are union charter schools right now, and I would be interested to find out how their academic performance fares against the non-union Commonwealth charter schools. I know one's in the Cape, and I believe one is in possibly in Brighton. And then finally, were you aware that Gloucester's anticipated annual new revenue growth for both the city and the school budget is typically about $1.4 million, and that's capped because of Prop 2.5. This is needed to accommodate increases in health insurance, salary raises, utilities, maintenance. The anticipated loss of Chapter 70 to the charter school will use up that entire revenue balance, leaving both the city and the school budgets with difficult decisions and subsequent cutbacks in services. We ask that the board of this charter school support the city resolution for charter school funding so we can continue to all offer quality education for all of our public school students. So respectfully, I just came up with these questions and I thought that they would be helpful. So, thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Oh, I guess I'm short. Do you have a copy that I could give to the rest of the board? Sorry, that's fine. I'm short. I need to give one to Mom.
John?
One of you have Mark Farley
John?
on this.
This one right here.
Sorry.
I was hoping over.
That's the wrong one. Okay. Sorry, nothing was slightly. Okay, so that's.
Okay, Val, is that your public comment then?
It is.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Are there any other public comments? All right, well, why don't we begin now that we do what I should do, which is review the agenda. Third item is that we'll review and approve any minutes that we have for approval. The fourth item will be that Mark Cannon, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Charter Public School Association, will speak. Then we'll have the fifth item, will be committee updates on the Facilities Committee. And the Finance Committee met just before the Board of Trustees meeting. And there'll be some recommendations that came up from the Finance Committee board meeting. And then we will, sixth item will be discussion of possible agenda items for the next meeting. And the seventh and final item will be determined on this meeting. So with that, let's go to item number 3, the review and approval of minutes. What minutes do we have? review and approve.
Yeah, no, so Jane, we don't have minutes right now.
We don't, okay.
Thanks to Mary actually for drafting them, but they're
Right.
waiting for.
That was fine. Okay. Okay, so then we will table that until next time, because that meeting, those minutes was just in the last, just last week, yes, okay. All right. Okay, well, so we'll table that item, and we'll pick it up at the next meeting. And next will be our speaker, Mark Kennan, Executive Director from Massachusetts Charter Public Schools Association, speaking of Charter School Fund. First of all, thank you, Mark, for coming to the next group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, the board, for the public. Thank you very much for the invitation to come out and talk to the board. It's not an opportunity to get all the time, so I really appreciate this opportunity. Just a little background for those of you. The Charter School Association is now in its 11th year. We represent 62 Commonwealth charter schools across the state, 61 of whom are dues-paying members, including your school. Historically, primarily, we've been both an advocacy organization representing charter schools in the legislature and in public discourse, as well as have an extensive program helping our schools document their best practices and share those best practices with other charter schools, district schools across the state, and in fact across the country. Both because we feel it's our moral obligation to take our successes and share it, as well as our legal obligation as written out in Massachusetts state law as our mission as charter schools to disseminate. Our organization is run by a board of directors of 15 charter school leaders or board members elected by the membership across the state, and they're ranging anywhere from Hyannis to North Adams, and a large section obviously in Boston. I was asked tonight to talk about the school committee's resolution, and I'm happy to do so. It sounds like there's some questions in the public that stray a little bit from that. It's up to the board. If the board thinks it's helpful for me to address those issues, I'm certainly happy to. But also limit my initial presentation to the item that you actually asked me to come. I'm only going to talk really 10 minutes or so. My experience is when you start talking about state funding formulas, people's attention span is about 8 minutes, sometimes 9, and they start to gloss over. But I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along and have a conversation with you at my hand. What I'd like to do is to start out talking about how the funding formula works as it is right now, how it works in existence, and then talk about the potential implications for charter schools and charter school students of the proposal passed by the school district and the city council and supported by the mayor. So the way the funding formula works now, and again, please stop me if you have any questions, okay? It's easier to do it, go along and try to backtrack later. And I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because it's only slightly less complicated than Chapter 70 in understanding how it works. So basically the idea is, as mentioned earlier, is that the money does follow the child in Massachusetts. So the child moves from one public school to another, that in principle, the way the funding formula is meant to work is that the amount of money spent by that school district on that student will get transferred to that other public school, in this case the charter school. And that the way it's calculated is a little complicated, but basically there is a foundation budget for every city and town, every school district in the state. Now that foundation budget, contrary to the earlier statement, is actually adjusted based on the demographics of the student. So it's a different rate if they're in kindergarten, elementary school versus middle school versus high school. It's a different rate if they are an ELL student or a free and reduced lunch student. So those adjustments are made based on your demographics in the district and your demographics at the schools. The change was made about 5 years ago, the last time the legislature tinkered with the charter school funding formula. The state will calculate how much, so the first step in the funding formula is the foundation budget. Then the state looks at how much above that foundation budget the district is spending. So the district is spending 5% above foundation levels in their district, then the charter school per pupil goes up 5% above foundation level. So that's the second step. If the district is below foundation, obviously the district charter gets to the foundation level. Then the third step is that the state adds a per pupil for facilities. And this right now is $893 a year, which is supposed to be based on what is the average districts spend statewide on debt service and facilities maintenance. Now, right now, that number is about $950, $975, so we're getting below what we should be getting, but that's the way it's working right now. And that $893 is actually in the line item set by the legislature every year. It's a separate allocation from the foundation, we call Foundation Plus, whatever's over foundation. So that's basically how the formula works. But if you take the net school spending of the district, you deduct two major items: money the district spends on out-of-school placements for high-need special education students, and the money the district spends on retirement health benefits. Because it was 5 years ago the case that none of our schools were providing retirement health benefits. That's since changed. Many of our schools are now providing health benefits, retirement health benefits, because they're now in the GCACS program. But the formula still does not give us credit for those recalculating district net school spending. But after you deduct those two items, you take district net school spending, you divide it by the number of kids who are in the district, and you have a per pupil number. And that comes out to be about what the Foundation Plus, and plus facility number is. It doesn't come out exactly that you get exactly the same amount of money as a district spend, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. But the other thing that's important to remember is that there are a lot of income revenue streams that districts across the state have that are not included in net school spending. Any kind of grant money they get, entitlement money they get, anything that's not the set foundation money plus is not counted in your per pupil calculation. In fact, a study done last year by researchers at Ball State University found that in Massachusetts, they did studies every state in the country, but in Massachusetts, statewide, on average, charter schools are getting about 75% of what districts are spending on their children, if you count all the revenue sources for districts. So we are still below where we would like to be in terms of what equal funding would be. However, we've over the years, agreed with the legislature not to push for more funding around changing that funding formula. We've accepted the 75%, but we didn't realize it was that low until the study came out last year. There's certain urban districts that get significant influx of external money, particularly in Boston, which skews things, so it wouldn't necessarily be the same in Gloucester as in other communities. One reason why we don't try to mess with that part of the funding formula. So as you know, when the state determines what the per pupil is going to be for your students, they then deduct that money from the Chapter 70 allocation for the district from the state. And they transfer that money to you. And that was set up specifically in 1993 so that districts were not required to write a check to the charter school. As you can imagine, with the relationship going on in this community, that would be an awkward moment trying to get the district to write checks and back and forth. So there's no money exchange, or there's supposed to be no real money exchange between the district and the charter goes through the state, which is supposed to be trying to eliminate some of the antagonism that would be created having to have direct payment. So that's the first piece of the funding formula, how your per pupil is allocated and how your money rides here. Any questions before I go to the next stage?
That out-of-district cost, where you say that's deducted from the funding formula, that is the per pupil. So in that letter, maybe it was Val's, where they talk about the 3.6 million for the 62 kids. Is that not part of that, or am I mixing apples and oranges here?
Without seeing in front of me, my understanding is if you're paying, if the district, whatever the district's paying for students to be outside, out of school placements, out of the district, that money gets subtracted by the state before they calculate what is net school spending for the district and calculating what your per pupil is.
So we're not taking a piece of that action, so to speak. So that might be something to cross out of that letter. Here's the second question, just so I'm not sure I quite get it. When they say $1.1 million for 268 students in East Gloucester School, that's $4,100 a student. Now that's not what that's just how the district chooses to spend that money. We're getting 11.3. Am I just not getting
I'm not
something?
sure what the first number was that you.
Okay, that came out of Kathy Clancy's thing. And
Okay.
so is that again apples to oranges?
Again, what can you run back to what that number is you calculated, that first number you calculated, 4,000 was made up of what?
Well, it's made up of them spending of 1.1 million for a school of 268. We're spending at full enrollment, we'd be spending 2.3 or whatever the number was. But that's apples to oranges because the high school might be spending more per pupil. Is that why we're getting 11 and those kids are only getting 4,100?
I can't comment on why the district is spending 4,100 if that's the number is accurate and what that includes, what goes into that calculation. Are you counting central administration costs
Yeah.
For that and all the back office?
I don't know. You were saying, well, they only are laying 1, 2, 3, but I guess I will try to read the letter more closely.
Val, can you explain that? Do you understand what he's asking?
Yeah.
Sure, the board would be happy to recognize Val Gilman and speak.
Okay,
Yes, please, thank you.
I don't want to speak on it.
No, I appreciate that, thanks.
Would you repeat the question, please?
I was just wondering if you could answer.
No, that's, you know what, I think I understand. As you say, that's how they choose to spend their money. That's not necessarily how we get reimbursed. So if they're only spending 4,100 in a school, if we're budgeted to get 11,000, that's not comparing us to a Mercedes to a Volkswagen, where your letter kind of intimated that we're driving some kind of fancy car, whereas that's how they choose to spend the money. They could spend the same 11,000 per pupil at each cost.
We can't spend 11,000 per pupil for all the kids in the district,
Because then you spend more at a high school, so that, right.
because high school,
They might be 15,000 each.
exactly.
Okay.
Because that is the way it is across all school
Yeah.
districts, not just in Massachusetts.
But your
Everywhere,
letter,
high
I
school
don't
is
want to
more.
because the letter is something about that's equal to our school somehow, but.
And the number, to answer to help you with your question, that comparison, there are missing elements to that. For example, it doesn't include our central administrative costs. Okay?
Gotcha.
So we do have a central administration office. But but the cost of our administrative office is very small, comparatively speaking. I believe it's 3.6% of our total budget, okay? And so if you take that, and then you look at the percentage that the school has in terms of administrative support, it's quite a bit larger here because of your ability to hire a much larger group of people for smaller population. So if you compare percentages there, that's where you would see some of the greater part of why it's not apples to apples, and in fact it's apples to oranges. Does that help you?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. I would just ask, I realize there'll be a lot of questions about this. If we could do this in an orderly fashion as possible so we can get through this, it would be great. No, Susan, that's fine. I'm glad you asked the question, but I'm fairly new to procedure myself, so I just want to make sure we do this as orderly as possible. I do have a question, Mark, and it goes back to the foundation, where you have two components to that. I'm always interested in the fact that one part of the foundation tries to take into account the demographics of the area, the needs of the kid, whether it's English as a second language is prominent, what the socioeconomic status, yeah. So in my mind, that would make the cost higher, and I've never understood this, but why is a place like Hamilton, Wenham Regional High School, for example, they actually have a higher Chapter 70 number than can you discuss that a bit?
And again, the politics of Chapter 70 are its own Byzantine kind of environment, and Val, as a school committee, probably can talk more intelligently about Chapter 70. But the problem, one of the things that's been raised by school districts across state is how they do evaluate the socioeconomic status of the community. They factor in a lot of criteria, including home values, as well as populations. But the fact that they include home values, like really skews things like, for instance, on the Cape, where home values are really, really high, but the population is relatively poor year-round, it skews their numbers. So you see a lot of communities that don't really make sense at first glance as to why their foundation budget level a certain amount, and how much the breakdown between the percentage of state responsibility and local responsibility to meet that foundation budget. It's been a source of contention among school districts, since it was created, and still is. And there's been a lot of attempts to try to address it in the legislature. Unfortunately, it's really impossible to address those kind of imbalances in funding formulas during lean times, because then you're reallocating money, taking money from one community, giving it to another, and that won't work. You can only really do that kind of thing when you have excess funds, so you can hold people harmless as you change funding formulas. But that's sort of why you see skewed Chapter 70 allocations.
Other members of representatives are advocating for their own areas and.
It'd be great to have Senator Tarr about that. I think, I'm sure you know a lot to say about Chapter 70.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you very much.
So, this funding formula that I just talked about, with some minor changes, it stayed relatively the same since 1993. The legislature has looked at this funding formula numerous times at the behest of school community associations, school superintendent associations, mass municipal associations, and both state teachers' unions. And each time they've looked at it, they've declined to change it, because after really careful examination, the last one being in 2010, when they passed the Act relative to the Achievement Gap, is the legislature found that that was a fair funding formula for both districts and charters. However, when the funding formula was first created in '93, within a number of years, many superintendents across the state were complaining that because the charter schools are awarded, charters are awarded in February, and new charters often start in September, that the district didn't have time to make the adjustments in their budget, because many of their budgets were already set or in the process of being set for the following fiscal year by February. So the legislature passed a law that reimburses school districts for 100% of the cost of the students for that first year. So the first year that a charter school opens, the district is actually making significant money, because they're getting value, 100% value of all the children, and not having the children to educate. So whatever the savings per child is, you can fight about what is fixed cost, what is marginal cost, and so on. There certainly are savings by the district in that first year. The legislature went further, and in the early years, then they passed what was called 160-40, which is a reimbursement program of 100% the first year, 60% the second year, 40% for the third year. So over 3 years, for every new dollar in the charter school the district so-called uses, the district is reimbursed 200%, twice the value of that dollar over 3 years, and then the money would go away. That still was not enough to make districts across the state feel that there was enough compensation. So as part of the Act of the Relative Achievement Act negotiations in 2009, 2010, the legislature upped that reimbursement program and changed it a little bit. So now it's 100% reimbursement the first year, and then 25% a year for 5 years. So over 6 years, the district's getting reimbursed for 225% of every dollar. And it's important to know, this is what gets so complicated, it's not per student, it's per new dollar. So even if your school is fully enrolled, if there's any inflationary costs, which almost always there are, and your per pupil or your revenue goes up, and so the district loses a little bit more money in a subsequent year, that district will get reimbursed for all that new money from 1 year to the next for 6 years on that dollar. Every one of those dollars, they'll get 2.25 times that dollar over 6 years. The next year, it's the same thing. So that money, so it's not that money's going to disappear when your school is fully enrolled. It'll drop dramatically, obviously, as your new dollars every year shrink. But there's always some reimbursement over the years. But the reimbursement for the first couple of years, in year 2 right now, I looked at some data earlier today on the website, and it looked like the district is getting almost $1.2 million in reimbursement money this year. I think it's about that your total cost, I think I have, the total cost I think is around $2 million for the school. The district's getting 1.3, 1.4 of that. The total cost, net cost to the district is less than $600,000 for 174 kids, which I think comes out between $3,000 and $4,000 a kid. So while the district is losing some money, the city, the town, the people in this city are actually getting additional money to public education brought into this community. There's over $1 million brought into this community that would not be here otherwise. I understand it's not going to district, but it is going to public education, and it's going to the children and the families of Gloucester. This reimbursement program, which unfortunately is not talked a lot about by charter school opponents across the state, is the most generous of any state in the country. No state in the country comes close to this kind of reimbursement program. And contrary to what someone said earlier in the public comment, it's not true that most states fund charters through state line items. In fact, that's not the case at all. It's that the number of states that do that are actually very small, and those states that do are looked at as the lower quality states. Because what happens is we will transition into the proposal that is in front of you. The proposal, as I understand it, is to take this whole funding formula we talked about, scrap it, and fund charter schools strictly out of a state line item. This is not a new proposal. I've been in this job for 11 years. This proposal comes up almost every year for the last 11 years. The association is strongly opposed to it, continues to be opposed to it. We will always be opposed to it. Our membership has always been unanimous in being opposed to it, and I would urge you as a board to not take a position in support. We do not need you to take a vote against it, but certainly not, I would ask you not to endorse this, and this is why. Anybody familiar with state budget process and state budget politics knows there's no such thing as a fully funded line item. It just doesn't happen in the state budget. Whatever a line item is supposed to be, it's not fully funded. You can look in human services, education, look in almost any area of the state budget, and you will find line items, almost all of them, that are not fully funded. And what happens is, in times of economic distress, line items are the first place the legislature goes to make budget reductions. 1% a year, 2% a year, 1.5% a year. And before you know it, your school is down 5%, down 10% from where it should be. The authors of the charter school funding formula in the legislature in 1993 deliberately tied the funding of charter schools to what districts get. Because charter school students are public school students. They're no less, no more public school students than any student that goes to school in the Gloucester School District. And the principle is that every public school student in this state, in this city, in the community, should get approximately, as best we can, spend the same amount of money on them. If you create a line item, if this proposal passes, you create a separate and unequal funding formula for those particular public school students. 30,000 of them around the state. A huge majority of them are low income and students of color. Obviously not as many in Gloucester, but when you look around the state, a huge proportion of our students. And so you're proposing, the resolution is proposing to create a funding stream, a funding formula that will inevitably, and legislative history will bear us out, will lead to less funding per student than their colleagues do or their peers do in the district. And with a population that is inherently more poor and more students of color, you can understand the political, social, and moral ramifications of creating that kind of system. It's a noble thought that districts want to try to create ways that charter schools are not at war with district schools. Certainly that is our desire as well. But there is something at the basic premise of charter schools that if a student leaves a district school, or leaves any school, there is going to be a loss of funding. One of the premises of charter schools is to create competition by creating choice for parents. And you don't have competition if you don't lose money as part of that competition. There is an impact on the district financially. There's also proven true around the state, if you look at districts, particularly in larger districts, but also in small districts, the competition is making districts change. It's forcing them to adapt the competition. So this is not only helping the charter school students, it's helping all the students in the district. Boston is the most obvious example. You can see all the different changes going on in Boston, creating turnaround schools, in-district charter schools, innovation schools, Horace Mann charter schools, all sorts of stuff going on because they've been forced to adapt to almost 13% of the loss of students and revenue in the city. And people would say that the changes going on in the Boston public school system are beneficial. I understand why that feels a long way away to people in Gloucester. But I would argue that even in Gloucester, if you haven't already, you will see the district responding to the competition that your school provides to the benefit of all students, both who will leave families in the district and families for many years to come. It's a painful process. I understand the conflict it's caused. It's not the first place that has conflict around charters. But when you see charter schools that have been in existence for a while in communities, once they're established in order to create relationships in the community, you're seeing them being beneficial to not just the charter schools, but the all students across the state, across the district. So, we think and feel very strongly that our students, being public school students, should get the same amount of money spent on them as their peers across the community. When the way the funding formula works now, if a district needs to cut their budget, that cuts your budget and your students' budget. If a district gets more money and increases their spending, your students get increased spending. That's the way it works, and that's the way we believe it should work, and why we continue to fight, and will continue to fight this proposal, and for protect our students, protect our children from less funding and unequal funding formula for them. So I think that's sort of my sort of set presentation about the funding and how it works from a really high level. I'm happy to answer any questions and discuss it. It would be helpful.
I was just, if I may, sorry, would anyone else ask this question first? Okay, thanks. Just on Val's list here, is in terms of what you're talking about the state line items, is there some research we can find out how the line items all work in other states and everything? Is there a site?
Oh, yeah, there's,
Just double check.
I have to go back and look. The National Alliance, no, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. National Association, yes, NACSA. That's a website. They've done tons of studies and profiles of funding streams, authorizers, and so on around the country. And so you can see, they'll have a breakdown, I'm sure.
Maybe some data on.
Yeah, and I understand that Massachusetts is somewhat different than most states around the country. In many states around the country, charter schools are authorized by school districts. There are only a handful now of charter school states in the country that have state authorizers. And so obviously when you're funding charters through districts, the whole dynamic, both academically, administratively, and financially, are different. What's great about the Authorizer Association is we managed to break down that information. So when you look at it, look at those states that have state authorizers and see where the funding streams come from. And then also go to go with it, I think you have to look at quality, because you know that we think that we have a funding formula that help protect charter school quality. The National Charter Public School Alliance, NCPSA, has recently done a study on the rigor of charter school laws around the country, around their accountability systems and their the rigor of their admissions process to get charters. And they found that we are number one in the country in our law as far as the rigor of our accountability and our charter application process. That has number 3 overall in terms of the charter school law. Only got downplayed because we do still have a cap in Massachusetts. So funding is one piece of it, but the quality is the other piece. And we've always been known in Massachusetts having one of the highest quality charter school programs in the country. Not quantity. There are many, many states in the country that have many more charter schools. California's over 500 now, Texas is over 400, Arizona over 500. We've always in Massachusetts, from the association perspective as well, focused on quality over quantity. So we only have 62 schools, barely 2% of the state population goes to charter schools. And we believe that it's only worth opening charter schools if they're going to be high quality. And so we support that as an association.
Somewhat, going back to the earlier point that was raised, and it's been raised many, many times, how do you respond to the case that we have individual schools in this district that if you do a breakdown of the expenses per pupil in any given school, that it comes out mathematically less than what we are getting on, at least on face value, as a per pupil return in this school?
I think Val indicated that when you look at a district, look at a school allocation, if you don't count the central administration, you don't count district-wide expenditures in that calculation, then you're going to come up with a much, much lower number. If you took out your central administration costs, your transportation costs, some of your special education costs that the district centralizes, your number for a school would be significantly less too. So that's why the state doesn't look at the individual school, they look at the district, because then you get all the expenses that a district incurs, which are all you're getting, because you have to pay all those expenses of one single school, if the district has the economy of scale, or ideally has the economy of scale on a district-wide level. So I would caution that it is apples to oranges, trying to compare what a particular school in Gloucester might be getting when you're not looking at the district as a whole and all the expenses that go into supporting that one school.
When the economy of scale varies depending on the district and how the number of individual schools there are within the district.
Absolutely, and how well those efficiencies are managed. Absolutely, it varies significantly. In some of the larger school districts, we're learning, even though they have lots and lots of schools, and then they're run so poorly in a central administration, so poorly run, it costs more to provide transportation for a whole district per kid than it might be for a charter who might be doing that on their own. So it's not a given that having economies of scale are there more going to be savings of dollars.
And the individual amount for students?
I just wanted to throw out the calculation on per pupil.
What do you think,
For districts,
Kathy?
$2,700.
The floor will recognize Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you. The calculation on district office expenses and all those other things that would be allocated, including transportation, is $2,700. That would be allocated to those elementary schools.
I looked at the number, I'm sorry, can I start?
Yes, please.
I looked at the number again quickly on the website this morning, and it looks like you have a budget of about $35 million or so as a district, a little bit more than that. And when you do it per average child, if you divide by the number of students, you're coming out somewhere in the 10 to 11 range per kid. So the district is spending $10,000 to $11,000 per child district-wide. So how the district then allocates that money to different schools, sets up central administrations, has pooled resources is obviously up to you. But in terms of the amount of money that you have to spend on each kid, it parallels very closely to what the charter is getting.
Yeah, except in that number is out-of-district special education of almost $4 million and our high school population, which requires a lot more subject matters for every child at the high school, which is, you know,
And we cover the
25%, and we cover the charter school transportation in our numbers too. So, you know, my point in my piece is that you'll never serve high school kids, and you'll never serve special education out of district kids. And therefore, those numbers are in the average you're getting.
No, that's me wrong, because the special education, the out-of-district is taken out of the calculation.
You said calculation of foundation, which is not taken out of the average calculation.
It's taken out of the average
But you
calculation.
just quickly did the calculation of 35 million divided by our school population, came up between 10 and 11. That's all our costs. So your simple calculations is close to what is actually being transferred over.
Right,
So
so the net school spending, again, I don't want to get into direct, but your net school spending, the $35 million doesn't include all your costs. It has the costs, there are revenue streams that are not included, including grants and some of your time that don't come under what the state calls net school spending. So we can argue numbers.
we get about 900,000 per circuit breaker for special.
So we can argue the numbers and see who has, that if it's 1,000 more, 1,000 less here. But the premise of and I wonder if you, and again, I don't want to get in debate with you here, but the premise of charter school students being members of Gloucester, citizens of Gloucester, getting spent a similar or somewhat equal amount of money spent on them as it would be spent on them if they went to a district school is the premise behind the funding formula. And that's what we support.
It would just be great if that
Okay,
premise
can I
was
just,
taken away.
because we have we really, this is not an open question answer, but I will recognize one more person. Do you have-
I mean, that's fine. I don't want to butt in, but I just want to comment on the one point that you did make, in fact, that the school system, Gloucester, will be reimbursed for the next 5 years. That's something that I don't think a lot of us knew. So that's an interesting point.
Reimbursed at 25%.
Actually, if I say that, just coming to
Please go ahead and keep that point.
Yeah, that's it. I would be happy to come to talk to the school committee at some point if you want to have a direct conversation about some of these issues with us. I would certainly, this is my 4th trip to Gloucester, and I'd be happy to keep coming back.
Just maybe just a clarification there on the points that you made. I mean, obviously, there's the Gloucester specific issue, and then there's also the statewide issue and nationwide issue. And it sounded like, from what you said, that the charter movement has been deliberately set up to serve underserved populations in general. I mean, in terms of the communities that are approved for charters, socioeconomically, the mix is to serve students who are the most challenged in terms of services of every type. That if you went, totally separate from argument over numbers, to a line item, which would make funding for the entire charter movement totally susceptible to the winds of politics, which change based on the economy at any given moment or who's in power and their feelings about it, you would basically put the entire movement, charter movement, which serves these populations that, particularly in terms of influence, access, have the least advantage of any populations in the entire state. And so you would actually put their education and education that is bound to be underserved at risk to whoever happens to be running and getting into office at that given moment, an economy that is having a downturn that everyone's not sure where that's going, and you would go immediately to cutting these programs out, and they would be completely susceptible or to someone just simply eliminating the movement.
Not to mention getting paid on time.
Well, yes.
I'm sorry, yes, board will recognize Val. Yeah.
Just one very simple comment. We can talk about this in concept and come up with different ways of looking at it. But the true issue here right now that we're struggling with here in Gloucester is just what our future numbers are going to look like, okay? And it doesn't matter if you're in the charter school or not. It's the totality of what these numbers are going to do to every person in the city, okay? So it doesn't matter what school you're at. It's going to create some huge angst in our whole community. And part of the reason why this is an angst is because we are under that threshold, because we're not on the favorable side of the chapter foundation, the chapter 7, because of the large properties that we have on Eastern Point, and they hurt us as they do a community like Beverly. So we're behind that, number one. We're under the 30,000. Third, we're not like all the 16 new schools, Mark, that you have just approved 16 new charters for are in Springfield, Worcester, Boston, huge, huge cities, okay? So the hit to communities like that with this whole formula is so much less than the hit to a small little community like Gloucester. Further, the issue that we have right now is that we have 5 neighborhood schools. We have 5 elementary schools. So when we don't know what schools are drawing into this charter school. So we can't go in a fair, consistent way, reduce teachers and staff at each school commensurate with the savings that you say is coming into the community, because it just doesn't work that way. You know, if we were all in one big school, it would be easier to be able to take care of some of those costs. We're not. And so much of our costs right now are just direct teachers and services that we provide. So, you know, I think, you know, conceptually we can, you know, the whole thing sounds really good from where the charters stand, but I guess I just ask the members of this board to sympathize and empathize with us in terms of looking at the numbers for the future, and they look really scary, regardless of what school you're in. And that's the point that we really need. That's why we need to change the way charters are funding. And, you know, we will continue on the school committee to really rally for that, because we have to provide quality education to 3,200 kids, and we're really afraid because these numbers are really scary. And it's part of today's budget. It's part of the economy. Prop 2.5, healthcare is trending at 10%. What does that do every year? It eats up 5 times more than you're getting for property tax. We're in a tough situation. And that's why we need to have these conversations. I think this is helpful. I think that this is healthy dialogue. Because, you know, we are all fighting for what's best for our kids, regardless of where we sit, you know, and I think that it's important that we understand where we're coming from. So,
Val, thank you very much, I appreciate that. And we had planned this to be a short meeting. Obviously, this is a very, more than just engaging subject, but I did want to see if we can proceed on, because we do have just a couple more items, and we do not really plan this to do. This is really not, I'm sure, Dave, I was going to say, if the board has any more questions.
Just want to take advantage of being here. Like,
Yeah.
I do appreciate your time. And I know you're quite a considerable distance away.
Thank you.
Particularly. You have a kind of unique perspective because of your position and the number of years you've worked on this issue. Can you give us some perspective on the experience of other towns, perhaps not the Bostons and the Springfields of the world, but the smaller towns that have created charter schools and the experience they've had in, I'm sure, very similar debates,
Well, actually,
and how
yeah,
that's worked out
sure.
now that you're looking back on it with 10 years perspective or whatever it might be?
You know, it's a good question. You know, especially a man out in Western Mass, right outside, west of Northampton, who in fact, as we speak, is having a conversation with their school committee and members of our association on this exact issue, because Northampton is considering this resolution at the same time. Western Mass is actually kind of a good example, because there are a number of charters out there that serve small communities, not the Springfields, Holyoaks, but in Adams, in Greenfield, in Northampton, and South Hadley, most of which those schools have been there for at least 5, not 15 years in some cases. And it varies, you know, it varies a lot about who is in the leadership of the different positions in the school committee and the mayor and the charter school. If there's a spirit and eagerness to collaborate, there's been some wonderful collaborations going on among some schools out there, particularly actually some of the charters out there have been more successful at creating collaborations with some of the inner city district schools than they had been with some of the local schools. In places where, whether it's a charter school leader or the district superintendent is feeling really hostile to the existence of the other one, then, you know, we live in this low-level, you know, low-intensity warfare that constantly goes on. But there are, you know, examples of places, River Valley up in Newburyport, which is the furthest anything Gloucester's going to keep going. Up to Newburyport, we have a school up there that is a Montessori, public Montessori school. And they've had, you know, some really interesting collaborations with their community and other communities around the Montessori model. So what we find, to be honest with you, is that when you end up talking with, no offense, but boards of trustees of charter schools and school committees, they talk to each other, or superintendents and board trustees, not much happens. Sometimes when you get principals talking to each other, you get a lot more collaboration. When we can find a way to get teachers to talk to each other, then all politics and all the fighting about money and control goes out the window. And there's lots of really great collaborations going on between teachers in district schools and charter schools, particularly in smaller communities where people know each other. On the Department of Education website, there is, if you dig a little bit in the charter school page, charter school office page, they have a document they put out that lists all the different dissemination and collaboration projects between charters and districts all across the state. So you see some examples of the.
Is there any centralized website you can go to, and if not, is it something that could be created where you could document when this collaborative relationship develops? Is it able to attract funding that might not otherwise be attracted? Because there are significant financial interests in support of charters, even within this state, that support charters and would not support public districts. But if through that collaboration you not only improve the educational environment for all students, but you attract funding, because the argument that no one can sort of walk away from is that for all school districts, charter, public, funding's an issue. Cost of special ed is an issue. So eventually everyone gets down to show me the money. You know, and I think that districts are chronically underfunded. They're underfunded in terms of special education. and to have something which showed, because I don't think anyone can really argue, even Diane Ravitch, against the fact that the charter movement, more than any other event in the past half century, has actually caused more dialogue at every level of society about education than any other one. And partly it is the creative destruction in terms of an economic term that can be caused by charter movements in particular districts. But the bottom line is, there are a lot of people who are putting a lot of time into trying to develop the best educational program for all children, and particularly in Gloucester. There are people with different opposing points of view around charter funding, but where we have common ground absolutely is that we want the best educational system for every child in this city. And I think that if there could be some real time put into, not let's collaborate and get principals together, but where is there funding to support collaboration between charters that have some freedom in terms of progressive education and trying new ideas that may not be readily available in every district, to really attract some of the substantial funding that is out there from foundations to come in and build educational program so that the money doesn't become such a serious issue for everybody all around.
I'll make that my last comment and let you move on. There used to be, until this past year, there was a federally funded, state-managed dissemination grant program for charter schools. Your school had to be in existence at the end of 5 years in order to qualify for that money. You get 2 years of funding to do a collaboration project with your local school district. That model was difficult to be founded, but it took a couple of years to really develop the collaboration. By the time the collaboration was developed, many was done. As you know, Tony, from your experience in education, trying to get foundation money for communities like Gloucester and other small communities around the state is really, really hard work. The Gates Foundation is about to pour millions of dollars into the Boston collaboration between Boston charter schools and the Boston public school system, because they really believe in that collaboration. So there will be money coming in. Getting that money to communities like Gloucester or Lowell or Lawrence or anybody besides Boston is obviously going to be a lot of work. We are always exploring ourselves, association, how to access. We had a federal grant for 3 years, a couple years ago, to help our best schools document best practices and hold study tours for other district schools. We have district schools sending teams to these states. So there has been some money, but if you're looking for money specifically that's going to come in and relieve the budget stress of your schools vis-a-vis the funding and collaboration, I think it's going to be a long way.
That's impressive. Because again, what happens basically is your smaller communities that are more stressed, have less funding, end up being the correlation again. It must be, I don't know, there's got to be a better way to bring political pressure in this area, because there's a lot of money out there, and I think we need to be figuring out ways to go after it.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you so much for the invitation, the time. Happy to come back anytime. Members of the school committee, happy to come and talk to you more about this as well anytime. Happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Just to let you know, Michelle Sweet is on the committee, Melissa Texera is on the committee, and Jonathan Pope will soon be back on our committee on January 1st.
You know where to find me now, so you know my contact information, so you can find me.
Okay.
I'm happy
I
to
truly
keep the
appreciate it.
conversation.
Thank you, Mark.
And excuse me, I do a 2.5-hour drive home.
All right, well, let's see. So for the next item on the agenda is the committee updates. The first one is the facilities committee update. I have recently formed the facilities committee, which will begin to undertake questions about the physical plan here. I would just say that one of the persons who has really been encouraging us to do this is our landlord. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Nick Lopata. And I don't know if this is appropriate. We want to have Mick come up and say something about the kind of facility issues that we're looking towards, or do you want to hold for later? till we have
It's
a-
not actually on
I'm sorry, excuse me, I'll strike that from the, excuse me, forgive me for that, okay. I just, because I was very happy to see Mick here, but apparently he will not be speaking. But basically the idea is that there will be a lot of physical plant improvement that will be undertaken, and we need to have a group that will specifically look at that. Part of the facilities committee will also go into the outreach type work that we first started talking about a while ago, which is where we have this wonderful resource. How do we work with the rest of the community with it? Gordon has done a lot bringing artists in here on a regular basis. I believe we had 26 artists attend and discuss with the children what the life of an artist was like, and he brought in their work and everything else. I think we also have a community choir. Do you want to talk about that for a second, Gordon? The choir.
A community choir? No,
They don't know.
I heard of that.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought that was your friend. Forgive me. Okay, that was, there is a, Tony, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah,
This is a facilities-related issue where our facilities will be used.
all students are invited from the Cape Ann area to participate in creating a real Gloucester community choir, hosted here, but not specific to the school. And what the school is doing is funding the cost of the director of music, Jeremiah Gallant, for all rehearsals and working with the kids. And so really exciting. We'll be putting up posters all around the city and neighboring towns to encourage students to come and be a part of it. And so
Is there a first amendment?
there is a first event on Veterans Day, and we'll get more information out to you about that.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Okay, so the facilities work is a work in progress, and we will have more on that at our next meeting. Let's see. We also wanted to discuss, under the committee updates, the Finance Committee, which just met. The Finance Committee had a recommendation for the, first of all, they reviewed and discussed the adjustments to the budget, where we have a new set of enrollment. We discussed briefly at the meeting, what this would mean in terms of any adjustments we had to make. But one of the action point of this was the review and discussion of a proposal regarding school financing credit, and a recommendation was made to the board to authorize an officer, and I will need Tony in this case, to negotiate any underwriting any line of credit or debt instruments that was needed to guarantee the school's financial operations. Excuse me, Nikki, would you have the wording of that?
To recognize Tony as a person with power to negotiate with creditors in accessing loans and lines of credit with the best terms possible.
Okay, so that would be the motion, if I may, if we can use that without my repeating it, or we can use it anyway. But the motion is before the board, from the recommendation of the Finance Committee, to authorize and empower Tony, who is our executive director, to enter into, negotiate, and borrow funds that may be required to finance the school's operation on whatever the most favorable terms are that we can obtain.
And through the chair, just there is state law requirement that any such negotiated credit line or must not exceed the terms of the charter granted. So just
The time terms.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So that would make perfect sense. I see. Right. Do I hear a second for that motion?
I'll second the motion.
Okay, thank you. Any discussion?
Just what I said before,
Okay, that's
that
fine.
every time is take back the moment that check rolls in.
We're going to be a good bidder and have a good creditor.
You have that twist in your arm.
Okay, so there be no other discussion. Can we put that motion to a vote? All in favor? Okay, so the motion carries then. So discussion of possible agenda items for the next meeting. As I mentioned earlier to Kathy, I did speak with Senator Tarr's office today, requesting that he come up and make a presentation about what's happening on the legislative front. So he is available on August 28th.
September 20th.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, thank you. September 28th, and he tentatively scheduled at 6:30 to 7:30 is the time to appear. So I know we've had a lot of meetings this month, but we have a lot to do this month, so we have some other issues as well that we could put on the agenda. But right now, the one that seems to be the most important is getting to the due diligence that the board has to do concerning the state of charter school funding and what proposals are out there in front of the body politic right now that we have to review. We could also put on the agenda the facilities committee work, any update by the finance committee. The governance board, because Jay's not here tonight to talk about any of that. So, and am I missing anything?
Well, also the points being raised that the process for approval of board member was flawed, and so I think we should address that by putting on the agenda that any nominees to the board should be invited to the next board meeting for open dialogue and interview.
Interview with the board, yeah. Okay. And so that's, any other?
Just along that line, we have to make sure that we tell folks to give you their CV for review as well by members of the public.
And James, I assume the committee reports at the next meeting would include governance, and that would include the approval of an evaluation.
A great point, Dave. Wonderful, thanks for bringing that up. Yes, we have, this is something we've been working on for some time, and so this would be the charge for the governance next committee meeting, which would be sometime before the 28th. So thank you, Dave, for mentioning that also. So we'll have to be in touch with governance about that. We will, at the very least, we'll have to have a governance meeting before the next Board of Trustees meeting for those items.
Yep.
Any other items for discussion for next meeting?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Any discussion? I'll let the record show that the meeting ended tonight at 7:15.
Without a vote?
I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry, it's still one day. All in favor? Thank you. Okay.
Second.